Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Terrible Old Man by H.P. Lovecraft. It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joe Zanuck and Manuel Silva to call on the Terrible Old Man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house in Water Street near the sea, and is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the profession of Messrs. Ricci, Zanuck, and Silva, for that profession was nothing less than dignified than robbery. The inhabitants of Kingsport say and think many things about the Terrible Old Man, which generally keep him safe from the attentions of gentlemen like Mr. Ricci and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is, in truth, a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so old that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few know his real name. Among the gnarled trees in the front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted so that they resemble the idols in some obscure Eastern temple. This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the Terrible Old Man about his long white hair and beard, or to break the small-paned windows of his dwelling with wicked missiles. But there are other things which frighten the older and more curious folk who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. These folk say that on a table in a bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles, and each a small piece of lead, suspended pendulum-wise from a string, and they say that the Terrible Old Man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and that whenever he speaks to a bottle, the little lead pendulum within makes certain definite vibrations as if in answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angelo Ricci and Joe Zanuck and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport blood. They were of that new and heterogeneous alien stock which lies outside the charmed circle of New England life and traditions. They saw in the Terrible Old Man merely a tottering, almost helpless graybeard who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry in their way for the lonely, unpopular old fellow, whom everybody shunned, and at whom all the dogs barked singularly. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is his profession, there is a lure and challenge about a very old and very feeble man who has no account at the bank, and who pays for his necessities at the village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries ago. Messrs. Ricci, Zanuck, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricci and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman, while Mr. Zanuck waited for them and their presumably metallic burden with a covered motor car in Ship Street, by the gate in the tall rear wall of their host ground. Desire to avoid needless explanations in the case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for quiet and unostentatious departure. As prearranged, the 3 adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicions afterward. Messrs. Ricci and Silva met in Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work making the Terrible Old Man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver, for aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, he was very old and very feeble, and there were two visitors. Messires Ricci and Silva were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble, and the screams of a weak and exceptionally venerable man can easily be muffled. So they moved up to the one lighted window and heard the terrible old man talking childishly to his bottles with pendulums. Then they donned masks and knocked politely at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Zanuck as he fidgeted restlessly in the covered motor car by the terrible old man's back gate in Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously he watched the narrow oaken gate and the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing where his treasure was hidden, and had a thorough search been necessary? Mr. Zanuck did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread or tapping on the walk inside the gate, heard a gentle fumbling at the rusty latch, and saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward. And in the pallid glow of the single dim street lamp, he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously. Mr. Zanuck had never noticed the color of that man's eyes. Now he saw that they were yellow. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the three unidentified bodies, horribly slashed as with many cutlasses, and horribly mangled as with the tread of many cruel boot heels, which the tide washed in. And some people even spoke of things as trivial as a deserted motor car found in Ship Street, or certain especially inhuman cries, probably of a stray animal or migratory bird, heard in the night by wakeful citizens. But in this idle village gossip, the terrible old man took no interest at all. He was, by nature, reserved, and when one is aged and feeble, one's reserve is doubly strong. Besides, so ancient a sea captain must have witnessed scores of things much more stirring in the far-off days of his unremembered youth. The Blue Spectacles by August Derleth. When he reached Cartagena, Jesse Brennan knew that his traveling was done. He was old, he was tired, and his illness had finally become too burdensome. He could not go on. The doctor confirmed it. He had perhaps a month to live, perhaps not that. Cartagena was sunny and warm. The Atlantic shone cobalt from dawn to dusk. The ancient walls of the old Colombian city pleased him. He had done more than one man's share of exploring, of poking about in the old places and the odd corners of the earth. He had no one to mourn him, but a few old friends scattered over the globe. He might as well die in Cartagena as anywhere. Back home in the United States it would be winter now, and he had no taste for winter. Better the sun and the cloudless sky and the restless sea. There remained the problem of disposing of those trifles he had collected, the things of value to fellow collectors. He set about this without delay, so that the burden of thinking about this final task might not cloud his last day. The stone clock of mysterious Indian origin could go to Faulkner in Cairo. Stuart could have the old German book bound in human skin. Rawlings, a hermit in his Edinburgh garret, would enjoy the curious figure from Burma, and MacLeod would find Prague more interesting if he were the possessor of the Borgia ring. But to whom to send the blue spectacles? Ah, that was a problem. The old Chinese mandarin from whom he had got them had been convincingly solemn about the wonderful properties of the spectacles. Where, he wondered, could he find a man whose soul was untouched by sin, lest by gazing through the blue glass something should befall him? He thought about the disposal of the blue spectacles for 2 days. After he had packed and shipped everything else, the spectacles remained. But then, in the night, under the guileless moon, it came to him. Alain Vernet, of course. Too honest for his own good, too sincere to recognize hypocrisy, faithful, dogged, moral, yes. the blue spectacles would be safe with him, if indeed they had any of the properties attributed to them. He did not remember Vernay's address, nor could he find it anywhere in his things, but Vernay had been curator of some sort of museum in New Orleans, and he would doubtless be in the directory. So he did up the spectacles on a compact box, wrote a letter to enclose with his gift. I got these from an old Chinese in Tibet. How old are they? I don't know. He didn't know either. They are said to be magic in a peculiar way. If anyone who is not wholly good looks through them, something will happen to him. I gather that he will be given sight of himself in some previous incarnation, or time, or something of that sort, and that it will not be pleasant, or a change of identity in which punishment shall fit his crimes. You know how these legends go. I'm almost ashamed to confess that the old fellow was so convincing that I myself never wore them. I was never good, much less wholly good, and at this stage, there's hardly any use lying about that, is there? Addressed it to Alain Vernay, New Orleans, Louisiana, USA, scrawled across one corner of the package, "Directory service, please," and dispatched it. He put no return address on it, because Vernay would recognize the Jesse who had signed the letter. In any case, it did not matter. He was dead before the little package reached New Orleans. It came into the city on the first day of the annual Mardi Gras, and being marked for directory service, it was passed along to the proper quarters, where a much harassed clerk, wishing her day over and her work done, though there were hours yet to pass, received it among other pieces of mail similarly marked. All in good time she came to the package from Cartagena, noticing the stamps first and thinking of her niece's stamp collection. Being constantly subject to all kinds of script, she had developed some facility in reading the scrawls that passed beneath her eyes. But Jesse Brennan's script, while superficially legible, tended towards carelessness, so that his eyes were dotless, and many of his consonants run together, with the result that shifting her eyes from the stamps to the address, she must serve as she read it at once, Alain Vernay. And why should she not, when one Alain Vernay, most peculiar divorce cases had been won that day, and his name was everywhere, from the Globe to the Picayune, and who, but somebody in Colombia, would not know his address? She added it to Brennan's script and sent the package on its way. At the moment of its arrival, Alain Vernay was at the telephone. Where was the domino he had ordered? He knew it should be in his hands. Indeed, it should have awaited him on his return from court. But, though his costume and everything else was in perfect readiness, there was no domino, and none other to be had, admitted his customer reluctantly. Vernay's first thought, therefore, at the arrival of the package was that the missing domino had turned up, though it was long since in the hands of a black roisterer, who had found it where it had been lost out of the package from the customers. But the sight of the stamps disillusioned him. Nevertheless, he opened it, wondering whom he knew in Cartagena, where he had never been. He looked first at the signature. Perhaps Jesse Melanchthon, who had gone to South America somewhere after his day in court. The letter puzzled him. He misread its salutation, which characteristically Brennan had written so that it might have been Alan, Aline, or Alan. He had no reason to feel that any error had been made. Still, Melanchthon was likely to remember the address of his apartment. He came at last to the spectacles. Even he could recognize their age. It needed no explanation, such as was in the letter, for the glass in the spectacles was a strange cloudy blue, a kind of smoky blue, the like of which he had never seen before, and their frame was evidently hand-wrought of silver. He put them down on his dressing table and read the letter once more. A curious thing, certainly. Whoever Jesse was, he was a superstitious man, just as certainly. He brushed the letter and the wrappings of the package to one side, and was about to lay the spectacles away, when a thought struck him. He looked at the spectacles once again. They were large, square. They had but a narrow bridge and were thickly framed. Awkward thing to wear, no doubt, but in the circumstances quite proper. They were not out of character, since Vernew was about to join the maskers in the costumes of a New Orleans dandy of more than a century ago, and the blue spectacles would do very well indeed in place of the missing domino. He carried them to a mirror and put them on. He could not have devised a better concealment for his eyes, for he could see through them very well, but none could see his eyes behind them. There were reasons why he would not like to be known behind the mask. There were irate husbands and equally irate fathers, some of whom had threatened him with various degrees of dire punishment. Moreover, as a divorce lawyer, he entertained many feminine clients who, if they were not guilty of adultery when they came to him, were guilty at leaving. Myuu having a facility for exacting fees in coin, other than money, his success incorporated envy and contempt. His successes with the ladies bred hatred and jealousy, but his boldness knew no end, and his self-assurance never faced retreat. He got dressed, went outside, and took a cab to where the roistering crowds were gay along the streets. There he left the cab and mixed among them. Tall, saturnine, handsome, still young at 40 and attractive, secure, before his roving eyes, he wore the blue spectacles. He had taken part in the Mardi Gras many times before. It was no novelty to him, and he had not come particularly to enjoy the celebrants or even to watch the parades and the floats. His role was predatory, and his eyes darted hither and yon in search of likely women who might be unable to resist his charms. He walked leisurely about. Now that he was in the midst of the celebrants, he had ample time at his disposal, and there was no need to hasten. There were hours yet before he need make his choice among the masked women who danced all around him. He had not gone far, however, before he reflected that he had never seen the crowds quite so riotous and gay, and thinking thus, he chanced to look up to see where he was. After a moment of puzzled gazing here and there, he had to admit to himself that he did not know. Somehow he had wandered into a section of the city completely strange to him, despite certain similarities in old gables and corners. Observing this, he stood quite still and scrutinized his surroundings with his practiced legal eye. During the interval of his examination, he saw surprising things abounding. There were no street lamps of any kind. There was no modern vehicle in sight for as far as he could see, even such floats as were there being horse-drawn. The hour being close to twilight, many of the roisterers carried crude, homemade torches, while others carried lanterns of a decidedly old-fashioned kind. He noticed these facts with mounting amazement, but he had no time to speculate on them, for at that moment he felt the tap of a fan on his shoulder, and, turning, found himself looking into the eyes of a strikingly beautiful girl, momentarily raising her mask so that he might see her. "I've been looking for you," she said mysteriously. "Have you?" he answered, for lack of anything else to say. "You're late." "I came as soon as I could," he answered, determined to play her game. How beautiful she was. Creole, he thought, certainly of mixed blood somewhere in her background, with black eyes like something alive and fathomless as a distant sea, soft velvety skin, long slender hands. Even in the ruffled and bustled costume she wore, it was possible to recognize that her figure was superb. He forgot about the strangeness of the street on which they stood. "Come," she said, and began to move swiftly away from him, darting in and out among the crowds. His pulse quickened. "Wait for me," he called after her. She turned her head briefly and went on. He started forward, determined to catch her. The old excitement of the chase filled him, and his only goal now was the pursuit, after which the conquest would surely be his. He did not stop to think who she might be. He had not recognized her face. He knew only that she was beautiful, far more than ordinarily so, that there was something haunting about her eyes and her mouth, that vaguely deep in his mind there was a familiar echoes of somehow, in a far past time, he had known the enchantment of a woman like her. She wove in and out, fleety, light, and graceful. But try as he might, somehow he could not catch up to her. She remained always just in sight, and once or twice she paused mockingly, as if to wait for him, but always she was gone, just as he came within easy speaking distance. He smiled, and his smile held. In one way or another, in and out of Mardi Gras, he had done this a great many times, and almost always he had emerged the victor. There was no reason why he should not add this vixen to his list of conquests. He redoubled his efforts. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the crowd thinned and was gone. They were alone in a side street, just the two of them, with her white dress 6 or 7 doors ahead of him, and her mocking laughter drifting back in the warm air. Night had fallen, and no light shone, but it did not matter. Like a will-o'-wisp, she remained always just so far ahead of him, lighter and fleeter on her feet than he. and more sure of herself in the darkness, for once or twice he stumbled and almost fell. He had no idea where he was. He did not care. His one thought was to catch up to the woman ahead of him. To find his way back would be a matter of moments, once the conquest had been accomplished. Quite suddenly she paused. She waited until he was almost up to her when she turned into a dark, bush-girt lawn, running swiftly to a wide veranda, up the steps to a door, and into the house that stood there. She left the door standing ajar, which was a patent invitation. He followed. Inside, despite the darkness, he saw her vanishing into a dimly lit room. There, too, he followed. Instantly, it seemed the room was alight. The door was shut behind him. His quarry was over across the room. Before him and all around, even at his back, between him and the door, there were men, all in costume, the costumes of pirates clearly, but none was masked, and the domino was gone from the face of his quarry, also as well as the smile. For a moment the tableau held. Everyone looked at him with grim tenseness, as at an intruder whose intrusion must be punished. He felt a brief thin pricking of fear, but of course it was Mardi Gras, and people would understand. Or would they? There was something ominous in the tense quiet of the room. He looked quickly around, his eyes searching for a familiar face. He saw none. The tableau broke. The circle closed around him, save for one arc directly before him, in the center of which sat a roughly dandified man, wearing a smart black beard and mustache. He was toying with a short-barreled pistol of some ancient manufacture. He gazed at Vernew with a mixture of indifference and contempt, which did not conceal his grimness. "Monsieur Vernew," he said, rather than asked. "I am known," said Vernew with a faint smile. "Speak when you are spoken to," said his host curtly. Vernew brittled. "Look here. I admit to entering the house at the indirect invitation of the young lady, but Monsieur Vernew has entered houses after young ladies before this, I think," drawled the seated gentleman, and forced his attention with and without permission upon a good many of those young ladies. He nodded toward someone standing at his side. "Will you read the charges, Mr. Ehrman?" "Whom have I the honor of addressing?" asked Vernew peremptorily. There was a ripple of laughter. The seated gentleman rose and made a mocking bow. "Pray forgive me, sir," he said with an edge of unmistakable contempt in his voice. "I am Jean Lafitte, at your service." His acting, thought Vernew, was startlingly real. "I'm sure you will excuse me, gentlemen," he said, "but it is Mardi Gras and—" "Hold your tongue," said Lafitte, and waved a hand to Ehrman. "Read." On the 6th of February of last year, he accomplished the seduction of Claire Péchon, 16 against her will, read Ehrman in a clear voice. On the 2nd of March, Mademoiselle Julie Argenton, with child by him, took her own life by drowning. On the 18th of April, he seduced Madame Thérèse Mounon, wife of Leon, who, discovering himself a cuckold, shot his wife and then himself. On the 10th of May, he deflowered Janice Bougereau, 17. Vernew wanted to shout his denial of the ridiculous account, but there was something puzzling, something shockingly confusing inside him. For though he knew none of the women whose names were being read out with such solemnity, it was undeniable that as each name was read, there rose from some unknown depth of memory the picture of a woman's face, successively of a 16-year-old girl, and one slightly older of a married woman, of another girl, pictures which in some remote corner of his mind were recognizable. Words struggled to his lips, but they were not of denial. "The prosecutor has forgotten the year of his charge," he said, as if by rote. "Since this is 1811, the year must be 1810, said Lafitte. "You're more particular in this than ever you were about your victims, Monsieur Vernew." The confusion inside him increased to chaos. Were there two of him, then, that he could remember things which he knew had never taken place? What was this of 1810, 1811, now in this 20th century? "Monsieur Vernew does not seem to understand that he is standing trial," said Lafitte. "Trial?" echoed Vernew. "Gentlemen, I am in a fog." Indeed, murmured Lafitte. "A good ladies' man was never a good swordsman, and quicker to know fear than most men. You shall have justice, do not be alarmed. What have you to say in your defense? No words came. There were words deep inside him somewhere, but they could not find an outlet. Come, say, is it true that you have seduced young girls? He could not answer. Lafitte turned to Airman. Put down that the prisoner has admitted to it, and to renew once more, and that you have persuaded silly married women to adultery. No answer. Once more he assents. And now, Monsieur Renewal, is it not true also that on the 7th of this month you attacked and ravaged Elise Gautier, my ward? Lafitte fling his arms out to indicate the woman who, but so short a time gone by, had been his eagerly desired quarry. He wanted to say that he had never seen her before in his life, but he could not be sure. It seemed to him that memory of her lingered, but from what source he could not say. He did not know. How had he come here? The woman, yes, but how had it happened? Part of him recalled the unlit streets and thought them natural, but part thought them wrong, knew them wrong. What was happening to him? What fantastic conspiracy was this? Lafitte had stood up. Monsieur Paul Renew, will you hear your sentence? He wanted to say, my name is Alan Paul, but nothing came from his lips, and indeed at the moment he could not be sure that anything at all came from any tongue or throat, for he had cast down his eyes and seen not floor, but long grass, and an edge of stone as of a stone box of some kind. To be shot, Lafitte was saying, now. Instantly, half a dozen of the old-fashioned pistols were leveled at him, cocked and ready. Aim, said Lafitte to the widening circle. Renewal stood as if paralyzed. If only he could know. Which was the dream, this or that other? Which was the reality? That distant world in which he was a counselor, or this world of the dandy of New Orleans in 1811? Which indeed? Fire, said Lafitte. There was a round of blasts. Briefly, the world of Alan Berneau was a turbulence of strange smoky blue. They found him in a long-abandoned cemetery in the outlying country south of New Orleans, though still within the city limits, dead. By what means, none could say. There were some half a dozen bluish marks on his flesh, as if bullets had gone into him, but no skin was broken. In the course of the inquiry, it was discovered that Renewal had been seen rushing madly through the Mardi Gras crowds in pursuit of someone no one had been able to see, that he had been observed by a passerby in the cemetery, standing quite alone, talking and gesticulating, so that his observer thought him drunk and went on, that the cemetery stood on the site of an old house, once the property of Desiree Gautier, that the house, according to legend, was the scene of the fatal shooting of an ancestor of Renewal's more than a century ago. When he was found, Renewal still wore the blue spectacles. Since Alain Vernet was curator of the City Museum, he saw and recognized their value, and in good time he got around to adding them to his collection, thus accomplishing Jesse Brennan's original intention. No Ships Pass, by Lady Eleanor Smith. I'm glad, thought Patterson, that I've always been a damn good swimmer, and he continued to plow his way grimly through the churning, tumbled argent of the breakers. It seemed hours, although it was actually moments, since the yacht had disappeared in one brief flash of huge and bluish flame. Now the seas tossed, untroubled as though the yacht had never been, and the boat containing his comrades had vanished with such swiftness as to make him think that it must have been smudged by some gigantic sponge from the flat, greenish expanse of ocean. The strange part was that he was able, as he swam, to think with a complete, detached coherence. He was conscious of no panic. On the contrary, as he strove with all his might to gain the strip of land dancing before his eyes, his mind worked with a calm and resolute competence. I always thought we'd have a fire with all that petrol about. Curse all motor yachts. I wonder if the others have been drowned. Good job, I have the boat amiss. He was not even conscious of much regret as he thought of the probable fate of his comrades, his employer, his employer's son, the members of the crew. Already, as he swam on and on through gently lapping waves, the yacht and those who belonged to it had become part of the past, remote and half forgotten. The present and the future lay ahead, where a long line of sand shimmered like silver before his eyes. Yet it was funny, he mused. There had been no sign of land seen from aboard the yacht, and it was not until the actual panic of the fire that he had noticed the dim shape of this island, near enough to swim to, as he had cried to the others, but they swarmed into the boat, taking no notice of his cries, and so he had embarked alone upon this perilous adventure. He was a strong swimmer, but he was growing tired. Were his limbs suddenly heavier, or had the sea become less buoyant? He clenched his teeth, striking out desperately, then floated for a while, laying on his back, the huge arc of the sky towering 1,000,000 miles above him like some gigantic bowl, all fierce hydrangea blue. When he turned to swim again, he was refreshed, but more sensible of the terrors of his situation. And yet, was it his fancy, or had the shores of the island loomed nearer during the moments of this brief rest? At first he believed himself to be suffering from hallucination. Then, as he looked again, he realized that he was making remarkable progress. He was now so near that the beach glittered like snow in the tropical sunshine before his eyes, and the sands dazzled him. Yet he could perceive lapping against them a line of softly creaming surf, and above the sands there blazed the vivid jewel green of dense foliage. The gulls wheeled, bright-winged against the brighter silver of sea and sand. Then he was prepared to swear that his ears distinguished, sounding from the shore, a harsh and murmurous cry that might have been, for he was very weary, something in the nature of a welcome for the creature trying so desperately to gain this sparkling and gaudy sanctuary. And then exhaustion descended upon him like a numbing cloak, and his ears and his brain whirled. His limbs seemed weighted, and his heart pumped violently. He thought he must drown, and groaned. For at that moment life seemed sweet and vivid, since life was represented by the island, and the seas were death. Well, now for death, he thought, and as he sank, his foot touched bottom. He realized afterwards that he must have sobbed aloud as he staggered ashore. For a moment, as he stood ankle-deep in warm, powdery sand, with the sun pounding fiercely upon his drenched body, the surf curling at his feet, and the cool greenness of a thickly matted forest cresting the slope above his head, he still thought that he must be drowning, and that this land was mirage. Then the silence was shattered by a shrill scream, and a glowing parrot, rainbow bright, flew suddenly from amidst the blood-red shower of a tall hibiscus bush, to wheel gorgeous and discordant above his head, dripping fire-colored blossom, loud, jangling, piercing cries. The island was real. Patterson fainted, flopping like a heap of old clothes upon the smooth, hard silver of the sand. When he came to himself, the sun was lower, and the air fragrant with a scented coolness that seemed the very perfume of dusk itself. For a moment he lay motionless, his mind blank. Then, as complete consciousness returned to him, and he rolled over on his face, he became aware of a black human shadow splashed across the sands within a few inches of where he lay. The island, then, must obviously be inhabited. He raised his eyes defiantly. He could not have explained what he had expected to see. Some grinning, paint-rattled savage, perhaps, or else the prim, concerned face of a missionary in white ducks, or perhaps a dark-skinned native girl in a wreath of flowers. He saw actually none of these, his gaze encountering a shorter, stranger form, that of an elderly, dwarfish man in what he at first supposed to be some sort of fancy dress, comical clothes. He gaped at the short, jaunty jacket, the nankeen trousers, the hard, round hat, and most singular of all, a thin and ratty pigtail protruding from beneath the brim of this same hat. The little man returned his scrutiny calmly, with an air of complete nonchalance. He revealed a turnip face blotched thick with freckles, a loose mouth that twitched mechanically from time to time, and little piggish, filmy blue eyes. "Good God," said Patterson at length. "Who are you, and where did you appear from?" The little man asked in a rusty voice proceeding from deep in his throat. "Have you tobacco?" "If I'd had, it'd be no use to you. Do you realize I swam here?" "You swam? From where?" There was silence for a moment, a silence broken only by the breaking of the surf and by the harsh cry of birds, as Patterson, more exhausted than he had first supposed, tried idiotically to remember to what strange port the yacht Seagull had been bound. He said at length, We were on our way to Madeira, the southern Atlantic. The yacht, a petrol boat, caught fire, and so I swam ashore." "Petrol?" The man replied, puzzled. "I know nothing of that. As for the southern Atlantic, I myself was marooned on these shores deliberate, many and many a year ago, when bound for Kingston, Jamaica." "Rather out of your course, weren't you?" The little man was silent, staring reflectively out to sea. Patterson, naturally observant, was immediately struck by the look in those filmy blue eyes, a singular fixed immobility of regard, at once empty and menacing, a glassy, almost dead expression, in which was reflected all the vast space of the ocean on which he gazed, and something else, more elusive, harder to define, some curious quality of concentration that, refusing to be classified, nevertheless repelled. He asked, "What's your name?" "Haywood. And yours?" "Patterson. Are you alone here?" The narrow blue eyes shifted, slipped from the sea to Patterson's face, and then dropped. "Alone? No. There are 4 of us." "And were they also marooned?" As he uttered his last word, he was conscious that it reflected the 20th century even less than did the costume of his companion. Perhaps he was still lightheaded after his ordeal. He added quickly, "Were they also bound for Jamaica?" "No," Haywood answered briefly. "How long," Patterson pursued laboriously, "have you been here?" "That," said his companion, "is a mighty big question. Best wait before you ask it. Or better still, ask it, not of me, but of the captain." "You're damn uncivil. Who's the captain?" "Another castaway, like ourselves, and yet not, perhaps, so much alike. Yonder, beyond the palms of the cliff, is his hut. I wouldn't mind going there. Will you take me?" "No," said Haywood in a surly tone. "Good God!" exclaimed Patterson. "I shall believe you if you tell me they marooned you for all your ill manners. I've swum about 8 miles, and need rest and sleep. If you've a hut, then take me to it. The captain will bide no one in his hut but himself, and one other person. That person is not myself." "Then where do you sleep? In the tree, like the baboons I hear chattering on the hill?" "No," Haywood answered, still looking out to sea. "I've a comrade in my hut, which is small, since I built it for myself. A comrade who was flung ashore here when a great ship struck an iceberg." "An iceberg?" Patterson's attention was suddenly arrested. "An iceberg in these regions? Are you trying to make a fool of me, or have you been here so long that your wits are going? And by the way, tell me this. How do you try to attract the attention of passing ships? Do you light bonfires or wave flags?" "No ships pass," said Haywood. There was another silence. It was almost dark. Already the deep iris of the sky was pierced by stars, and it was as though a silver veil had been dragged across the glitter of the ocean. Behind them on the cliffs 2 lights winked steadily. Patterson judged these to proceed from the huts mentioned by his companion. Then came the sound of soft footsteps, and there were no longer 2 shadows there on the dusky sand, but 3. "Hello, stranger," said a casual voice. Patterson turned abruptly around to distinguish in the grayness a sharp, pale face with a shock of tousled hair. A young man, gaunt-looking and eager, clad normally enough in a dark sweater and trousers. "And this is a hell of a nice island, I don't think," the stranger pursued, thrusting his hand into his pockets. He had a strong Cockney accent. Patterson was enchanted by the very prosaicness of his appearance. He brought with him sanity. Walking as he did on fairy moon-drenched shores, he was blessed, being the essence of the commonplace. "Name of Judd. Dickie Judd. I suppose you're all in. Been swimming, ain't you?" "Yes." And this fellow Haywood won't take me to his hut. Says it's full. Can you do anything about it?" "You bet," said Judd. "Follow me, and I'll give you a bite of supper and a doss for the night. This way, the path up the cliff. We'll leave Haywood to the moon. Come on." 10 minutes later, Patterson was eating fried fish and yams in a log hut, with an open fireplace and 2 hammocks swung near the rude doorway. He had noticed as they climbed the slope together a grander, more commodious hut built a few hundred yards away among some shady palms. This, he surmised, must be the home of the elusive captain. No sound came from it, but a light burned in the narrow window. As he ate his food, he speedily forgot the existence of these fellow castaways. He asked instead, gulping down water and wishing it were brandy, "How did you come here, Judd? With the others?" Judd eyed him swiftly. For 1 second, Patterson imagined that he detected in the merry greenish eyes of his companion the fixed, almost petrified expression that had so much perplexed him in the gaze of Haywood. If he was right, this expression vanished in a flash, yet Judd seemed to withdraw himself, to become curiously remote, as he answered coolly, "Not I. I came here after them, some time after." "Do you mean that, like me? You are the only survivor from your ship?" "That's about it," Judd answered, with his mouth full. "Tell me about it." "Oh, there's nothing much to tell. She was a great liner. I had a berth aboard her, and she struck an iceberg in mid-Atlantic. There was not room for me in the boat, so I jumped. But she was a lovely ship, and big as a city. Titanic, they called her." "You're pulling my leg. For heaven's sake, chuck it. I've had about enough for one day." "'Struth, I'm not," Judd told him energetically. "But no matter. You don't have to believe me." And he whistled, picking his teeth. Patterson asked with a shiver, "Look here, joking apart, do you mean to tell me that you honestly believe you were cast ashore from the wreck of the Titanic?" "On my oath," said Judd. He added, jumping up, "Bugs is bad here at night. Wait while I swat a few." "Just to answer this," Patterson interrupted, "why in heaven's name, when you think you were wrecked in mid-Atlantic, should you have landed here on a tropical island off the African coast? Bit of a miracle that, wasn't it?" Judd was silent for a moment, flicking at the mosquitoes with a palm leaf fan. He said at length, sucking his teeth, "Not being a seafaring man, I take it, you don't happen to have heard of a fairy story told among sailor boys all the world over. Story of a mirage island that floats about the seas near wrecks, bent on collecting castaways?" Patterson thought desperately. This man's as mad as Haywood, and that's saying a lot. And I've got to live with him? Aloud he said, "No, I've never heard that one. But there's one other thing I'd like to ask you. Who's this Captain Haywood was talking about? Has he been here for many years?" "I'll give you this goatskin for a blanket," said Judd, "and you can doss near the doorway, where it's cooler. So you know about the captain?" "I've only heard his name. I asked you, has he been here for a very long time?" "Many years," answered Judd, with a peculiar inflection. "Tell me more about him." Judd laughed. "You don't want to know much, do you? You'll clap eyes tomorrow on Captain Thunder, late of the bark, Black Joke. Well known, he's always boasting, from Barbados to Trinidad and back again. But you may whistle for the captain tonight." Patterson was sleepy. "Sounds like a buccaneer," he muttered into the goatskin, was soon unconscious, oblivious even of Haywood's noisy entry into the hut. By early morning, the island's beauty seemed more exotic even than the radiant plumage of the parakeets darting to and fro in the dim green light of airy treetops. Patterson was refreshed after a good night's sleep and consequently less depressed. He bathed with Judd, leaving Haywood snoring in his hammock. The beach was a shining snowdrift, the sea a vast tapestry of hyacinth veined and streaked with foam, glowing, glittering in the brilliant sunlight. They swam for 20 minutes and then lay basking on the suns. "Hungry?" Judd inquired. So delicious was the morning that Patterson had quite forgotten the eccentricity manifested by his comrades the previous evening. Rolling over in his stomach, he was about to reply an enthusiastic affirmative when he surprised once more in his companion's gaze that bleak, fey look that had always disconcerted him. He could not understand it, yet it was as though a somber shadow fled across the beach, obscuring this gay and vivid world of amber sunshine, creaming surf, tossing sea, and glowing brilliant blossom. Beauty was blotted out when Judd, the commonplace, looked like that. He felt suddenly lonely, humbled, and scared. "Judd," he said suddenly, and Judd wrenched his eyes away from the horizon. "Judd, listen and please tell the truth. Just what are our chances of getting away from here?" Judd eyed him thoughtfully. "If you want the truth, we haven't any. Sorry and all that, but there it is." "Rubbish," said Patterson. "A ship will surely pass one day, just because you've had bad luck." "No ships pass," Judd told him. "Rubbish again. Look how close mine came yesterday. The trouble with you, Judd, is that you've been here too long and got into a rut. I don't believe you care much whether you're rescued or not. Now I do, and I'll tell you my plans." "Listen a minute," said Judd. He propped himself up on his elbow, avoided his companion's eyes, and resumed. "You might as well hear it now. No sense in keeping it from you, although you'll think I'm pretty nutty. Listen then, Patterson. We're here for keeps. Get that. Look at the captain and his friend. Look at Haywood. If I told you how long they'd been here, you wouldn't swallow it, and I'd not blame you. But you've got to know sometime. We're here forever. Now I feel better." Patterson shuddered in the blazing sunlight. "Do you really think we've got to stick this until we die?" Judd flung a pebble at a pearly cloud of seagulls. "Worse than that, Patterson. Worse by a long chalk. I told you last night this island was mirage, magic. Stands to reason it is, floating around the world, picking survivors from shipwrecks in all the 7 seas. Well, there's something worse than that, much worse, and I'm going to tell you what it is. There's no death on this island. Death forgets us. We're here for all eternity." Patterson laughed nervously. "You should be in Bedlam, Judd. I suppose a few years' desert island does that to one. But look here. Now I've come to join you. We'll get away somehow. I promise you that." Judd slipped on his trousers. "You don't believe me, and small blame to you. I was like that once. But it's true. I swear to God it is. There's no death here. For the animals and the birds, yes. Or we should starve. But not for us. We're here for all eternity, and you may as well make the best of it." Patterson, trying to dress himself, found that his hands were trembling, yet he tried to be reasonable. "Look here, Judd. What put this crazy idea into your head?" "Do you know," Judd replied, "how long Haywood's been here?" "Of course you don't. I'll tell you. He was marooned in 1825. As for the captain, he's had a longer spell. He was a pirate, one of those Spanish Main fellows I read about when I was a kid. His crew mutinied in July 1795. "Very interesting," Patterson commented idiotically. "Don't you imagine," Judd continued, "that we haven't all of us tried to escape in the past? We've built rafts and boats. They've always been chucked back here on the beach by mysterious tidal waves or tempests. Then we've tried to kill ourselves and one another. We've been wounded and lain sick for weeks with mosquitoes battening on our wounds. And our wounds have festered, but we've pulled through. Now, we don't do that anymore. Too much pain for nothing. You will always pull through in the end. We tried to drown and swallowed quarts of water, but always we've been flung back on the sands here. Death's not for us. We've jolly well found that out, and so we make the best of it. It's all right after a time. You live for eating and sleeping, and you blooming well don't think. Sometimes you go mad, but in the long run, you get sane again. And you kowtow to the captain, who's got twice the guts of anyone. And oh yes, your clothes last just as you last. Funny, isn't it?" "What about breakfast?" suggested Patterson. "I knew you'd think me loopy," said Judd. "All right, Come on back to the hut." They scrambled to their feet, and there was an awkward constraint between them. Then Patterson pulled Judd's arm. "What's that? Look over there. Is that just another confounded mirage?" Judd screwed up his eyes. Beside the rocks, where seaweed flourished like green moss, a woman stood, skirts kilted in her hand. She was barefoot and sprang from one rock to another, with the grace and agility of a deer. She was gathering muscles. As she worked, she sang, and the drowsy, bell-like sweetness of her voice was wafted faintly to their ears, all mingled with the cry of seagulls. "Oh, that," said Judd. "Well, you better remember to act respectful when she's about. That's Doña Inés, the captain's girl. She was a prisoner. He had her with him on his boat when the crew of the Black Jake mutinied, and they were cast up here together. At least they both say so. First she hated him, then loved him for 40 years or so, and since then for about 100 years she's been fed up, but he's still keen on her. So keep away, that's my advice. Once Haywood went snooping about her and the captain cut his throat. He'd have died elsewhere, of course, and he suffered the tortures of hell, he told me. He'll show you the scar if you're interested." "Wait," said Patterson. "You've given me a turn with your crazy talk, and she's coming towards us. There's no harm, I suppose, in speaking to her?" "None, as long as you're respectful." They waited there on the sand, while the woman approached them. She was young, about 20, and extremely handsome. She wore a stiff flowing skirt of burning crimson and a little jacket of orange. Her dark, rippling hair hung like a black plume down her back, and her oval, vivid face was delicately modeled with high cheekbones, a mouth like red blossom, and immense, velvety brown eyes. She was Spanish, of course, and well-bred. Her wrists were fragile, exquisite, her bare feet slender and arched. Her body was lithe, graceful, and voluptuous. She moved swiftly, as though she danced, and as she drew near to the two men, a sudden soft breeze blew a lock of floating ebony hair across the fire and sweetness of her mouth. Patterson was dazed. He had encountered much superstition during the course of the morning. His stomach was empty, and he was but ill-prepared for such beauty. Doña Inés said gaily, speaking fluent, attractive English, "Good morning to you, señor. I heard last night of your arrival, but was not allowed to greet you. I so much desired to do so. Please forgive my execrable manners. We shall see so much of one another that it would be as well to start our acquaintance on friendly terms." Patterson pulled himself together and kissed her hand, a long, delicate hand, all dusty tanned with the sun. A huge diamond glared from her third finger. "Morning, Inez," said Judd casually. "Where's the captain?" "Micah?" She became suddenly indifferent. "Waiting for his breakfast, I suppose. I must go to him. Shall we walk up the hill together?" And so they went, and the Doña Inés moved lightly between them, all bright and flaming in her gaudy clothes, and told Patterson that he must accustom himself to this idea of eternity. After the first 100 years, these things mattered little, though. As well be here, laughing and walking in the sunshine, as in our graves. Don't you think so, señor? And I, who am talking to you, have so much experience of these things. Why haven't I lived here with Micah Thunder for nearly 140 years? And yet it might be yesterday that he sacked Santa Ana, he and his fleet, and took me prisoner when I was on my knees at Mass, and swore that I should be his woman. And so I was, both here and on his ship. But I've almost forgot the ship, and Santa Ana too. Now there's only the island, and yet I am not a stricken woman, am I? Nor yet a day older than when cast up on these shores. And so she prattled, her dark eyes flashing like jewels, until she and the two men came to the clearing where there were two huts, and there, in front of the smaller one, sat Haywood, surly as ever, eating. "Goodbye, señor," said Doña Inés. "We will meet later when I have fed my captain." Patterson sat down on the ground and said nothing. "Here's orange juice," said Judd, "and custard apples and some cornbread I baked myself. No butter, we don't rise to that, but all the same, we'll dine on oysters." Patterson ate in silence. He supposed himself to be hungry, and he thought that he was in a nightmare and would soon wake with the steward shaking him and find himself once more in a gay chintz-hung cabin of the Seagull, with bacon and eggs waiting in the dining salon. But he did not wake. "I'll help you rig up a tent after breakfast," said Judd. "I've got some sailcloth. It'll last you for a few days, and then you can build a hut for yourself." Heywood, eating ravenously, said nothing but eyed him in silence. "I wish," he thought desperately, "they wouldn't stare at me like that." And suddenly he knew of what their fixed eyes reminded him. They were like dead men in the way that they gazed, glassy and vacant. Their eyes were as the eyes of corpses. Perhaps their fantastic stories were true, and he had in reality been cast for all eternity upon a mirage island. "Oh Lord," he thought, "I'm getting as crazy as the rest of them. And yet the woman, the Spanish woman, seems sane enough, and she believes their tales." After breakfast, he worked at putting up his tent, sweating in the copper glare of the sun, while Heywood went on fishing, and Judd vanished into the woods with a bow and an arrow. No sound came from the other hut. When he had finished erecting his tent, Patterson lay down in the shade inside of it, and found himself craving a cigarette with a passionate, abnormal longing. It was stuffy in the tent, and mosquitoes clustered around his hot face. He shut his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep evaded him, and then, as he lay quietly in the oppressive darkness, his instincts, already sharpened by 24 hours' adventure, warned him that someone was watching him. He opened his eyes. Outside, regarding him impassively, stood a small, slim man in dainty, dandified clothes of green blue shot taffeta. These garments, consisting of a full-skirted mincing coat and close-fitting breeches, were smeared with dirt and seemed to Patterson highly unsuitable to desert island life. The little man wore cascades of grubby lace dripping from his wrists and rusty buckles on his pointed shoes. He bore himself like a dancing master and had no wig, which seemed odd to Patterson, who gaped at the gingery, close-shaven head, revealing glimpses of bare skull like pinkish silk. The face of this man was long and narrow and candle-pale, with thin, dry lips and pointed ears. His flickering, expressionless eyes were green as flames. He blinked them constantly, showing whitish, sandy lashes. His hands were long, blanched, and delicate, more beautiful than a woman's, and he wore on one finger upon the finger of Doña Inés. Patterson, disconcerted by the cold, unwavering eye, scrambled to his feet and held out his hand. It was ignored, but the captain bowed gracefully. "Captain Micah Thunder, late of the Black Joke, and at your service." He spoke in a high, affected, mincing voice. "I have already," Patterson told him, "heard talk of you, Captain Thunder, and am, therefore, delighted to have this opportunity of meeting you." "You're a damn liar," replied Captain Thunder with a giggle. "My fame, I understand, has not, through some absurd mischance, been handed down throughout ages, or so Judd informs me. They talk, I hear, of Flint and Kidd, even of Blackbeard, most clumsy bungler of all, but not of Thunder. And that, you know, is mighty odd, for without any desire to boast, I can only assure you, my young friend, that in the 3 years preceding the mutiny of my crew, I was dreaded in all ports as the avenger of the Main, and indeed, I recollect taking during that period more than 30 merchantmen." He sighed, giggled once more, and shook out the lace ruffles of his cuffs. "Indeed, sir," said Patterson respectfully. To himself he thought, in a sudden panic, "I must humor this man. He's worse than any of them." For the captain, with his conical shaven head, his long pale face, his deprecating giggle, his cold greenish eyes and high affected voice, seemed, as he minced there in the sunshine, most terribly like an animated corpse coquetting, grotesquely enough, in all the parrot sheen of silken taffetas and frothing lace. This creature, this little strutting jackanapes, so bleached and frozen and emasculated, looked indeed as though 100 and more years of living on the island had drained away his very life-blood, leaving a dummy, a vindictive, posturing dummy, clad in fine raiment, staring perpetually out to sea with greenish, fishy eyes. and something, perhaps the very essence of evil itself, a breath of cold and effortless vice, emanated from him to stink to Patterson like a rank and putrid smell. The odor of decay, perhaps, the very spirit of decay, for surely, in spite of sanity and common sense, this man should long ago have rotted, not in a coffin, but rather from a gibbet on execution dock. And Doña Inés, creeping up softly behind them, seemed brighter, gayer than a hummingbird in contrast to her pale pirate. Receiving a signal from her eye, he knew that he must make no mention of an earlier meeting. "My mistress, Doña Inés Samaniegos of Santa Ana," announced the captain with a flourish. "Your servant, madam," said Patterson formally, and the lady, very grave and beautiful, ran her hand lightly over the captain's sleeve and swept a curtsy, deep and billowing. She was not merry now, neither was she barefoot. She seemed haughty and had shod herself in high-heeled red shoes. "This flower," said Captain Thunder casually, indicating his paramour with a flick of a white finger, "springs from a proud and splendid Castilian family. Is it not so, my heart? I took her away when my fleet sacked Santa Ana, finding her myself, when my hands were steeped in blood above the wrists, praying in terror before a waxen and tinselled image of the Virgin. She was 16 and very timid, being fresh from convent. Before I wooed, I was forced to tame her. When I had tamed her, I was still enamored, and for 4 years she sailed the main as queen of my fleet. The Black Joke, my ship, and the Black Lady, as they called my woman, being accustomed to flaxen peasant maids from Devon, those were all I prized in life. My ship they took, my woman I have kept, and will continue to keep while we remain here." The drawling voice was icy now, and the light eyes had become green stones. Patterson realized he was being warned. He answered lightly, "And may I congratulate you, Captain, upon a lovely and most glorious prize." "Do you mind," said the captain to Doña Inés, "when that little ape Haywood tried to take you, and I slit his throat?" She nodded, her eyes very dark and lustrous. The captain turned to Patterson. "There is no death on this island, sir, as you will discover for yourself, but it is possible to fight, and fighting to inflict wounds. A sorry business. Very much, I declare, I regretted it when I saw the poor creature gurgling in mortal agony. He was sick for many days, but sooner or later we all heal. However, I am soft-hearted. Once my rage is appeased, and you will pray excuse me while I seek the shade. I'll leave Madam here to entertain you for 10 minutes, a change for her, a pleasant interlude for yourself, and 10 minutes then, my dove." Bowing, he retreated, walking away with pointed toes, more like a dancing master than ever. When he was out of earshot, Patterson said impulsively, "I'm not enamored of your captain." "And I," she said thoughtfully, "was once enamored of him for 40 years. And now?" Patterson wanted to know. "Now," she scooped up some sand and let it sift through her fingers. "Oh, my poor young man, does anyone remain in love for all eternity? Do you really believe in that pretty legend? Then you hate him?" "Hate? No. You can neither hate nor love for 100 years. I have suffered both, so I know, and tried to kill myself 3 times. Oh, yes, there is not much that I cannot tell you about love. One does not live as long as I have lived without learning wisdom." "And please tell me, Doña Inés," begged Patterson, "what you have learned about life in 140 years. 160, she corrected. "I was 20 when cast up here. What have I learned? One thing above all. To live without emotion. Love, hate, tedium, those are all words, very unimportant words. They are nothing. I like to eat when I am hungry, sleep when I am tired, swim when the sun is hot. All that is good, because it is just enough. I used to think. I never think now. I was mad, you know, for a little time, 5 years or so, because I thought too much. But soon I was cured. That was when, having both loved Micah and hated him, at last he sickened me. I imagined I could not bear that. But you see, I was wrong. She laughed, shaking back a tress of her hair, and he knew that with death she had also lost her soul and humanity. She was, as she had said, empty, drained of all emotion. She was as sterile mentally, this lovely lady, as the parakeets chattering above her head. But she was very beautiful. And the captain, he inquired, is it rude to ask what his feelings are toward you? Indeed, no. And she laughed again. The captain is still a man, although he should have been dead long ago. Being a man, he has need of a woman sometimes. Being a man, he is determined that other men shall not take that woman. That is all. Apart from that, like us all, he is petrified. And then, although the 10 minutes were not up, she heard Judd coming up the hill and slipped like a bright shadow to her own hut. Days passed slowly on the island. One day was like another. Always the sun poured brilliantly upon sapphire seas, gleaming sands, jeweled foliage. Macaws flashed like darting rainbows through the dusky green of jungle arches. The fruit hung coral bright from trees whose blossoms flung out trailing creepers gayer, more gaudy than the patterns of vivid Spanish shawls. And yet it seemed to Patterson, after 2 months, that all this radiant beauty was evil and poison like a sweet fruit rotten at the core. What should have been paradise was only a pretty hell. Slowly, reluctantly, he had been forced to accept the island for what it was according to his comrades. He now believed, although shamefacedly, that Thunder and Doña Inés had lived there since the mutiny of the Black Joke, that Heywood had been marooned in the last century for insubordination, that Judd had emerged from the wreck of the Titanic. And yet, obstinately, he still clung to the idea of escape, and then once away from the island shores, he would regain mortality. He would wrap mortality about him like a cloak. Meanwhile, he noticed 1 or 2 curious facts. His clothes, after 8 weeks' rough living, were almost as good as new. It was no longer necessary for him to shave more than once a week. And once, Judd, climbing a palm in search of coconuts, had slipped, crashing on his head, to what seemed certain death 50 feet below, and had been picked up suffering from nothing worse than slight concussion. This accident shook his faith more than anything else that he saw. They lived comfortably enough on fish, home-baked breadfruit, coconuts, and the flesh of young pigs found in the jungle. Patterson learned how to shoot with a bow and arrow, and to tell the time by the sun and stars. He learned to be patient with Heywood, who was half-witted, and he learned to search for turtle eggs in a temperature of 99 in the shade. He learned, too, to treat Captain Thunder with respect and Doña Inés with formality. Sometimes the captain, a reserved, sour-tempered man, would unbend and, fingering his cutlass, tell stories as a buccaneer of the Spanish Main. Terrible stories, these vile, filthy, sadistic stories of murder and vice, plunder and torture, and fiendish, cold-blooded, ferocious revenge. Told in his drawling, affected voice, they became nauseating, and yet Doña Inés listened peacefully enough, her dark eyes soft and velvety, her red, silken mouth calmer than an angel's. Sometimes she would look up and nod and say, "Oh yes, Micah, I remember that, don't I? I was with you then, wasn't I? You were my love, my heart. If you remember, I burnt your hand in the flame of my candle until you swooned because you affronted me by asking mercy for those dogs." And she would laugh. I was foolish, was I not, Micah? For what did it matter? Patterson, loathing these conversations, was nevertheless forced to listen because at night there was really nothing else to do. Always before, in his life, he had accepted books without question as being quite naturally part of his life. Now that he had none, the lack of them appalled him. He tried to write, scratching a diary on strips of bark, but the effort was not successful. Nor did his companions do much to ameliorate the loneliness of his situation. He preferred Judd to the others because Judd was young and gay and comparatively untouched by the sinister, dragging life of the island. Yet there were times when even Judd seemed to withdraw himself, to become watchful, remote, secretive. Patterson learned to recognize these as the interludes when his friend, pitifully afraid, thought in a panic of the future that lay ahead for him. Heywood was sulky and monosyllabic. The captain, so cynical and depraved, with his vicious mind, his giggle, and his will of iron, had revolted Patterson from the first. Only Doña Inés, with her vivid face and her beautiful, empty animal mind, seemed to him restful and gracious, like some handsome, well-behaved child, in this crazy world of sunshine and plenty and despair. For this reason she began to haunt him at night, so that he was unable to sleep, and he longed, not so much to make love to her as to rest his head against her and to feel her cool hand upon his forehead, soothing him, that he might forget for a few hours. But Doña Inés was watched so carefully that it seemed impossible to speak to her alone. And then one day, when he had been on the island for more than 3 months and was in a mood of black depression, he encountered her in the woods. He had wandered there in search of shade, aimless, solitary, and disconcerted. She was gathering moss on her knees, her bright skirts kilted, stars of sunlight dripping through the green and matted tent of foliage, cast flickering, dappled shadows upon the amber of her neck and arms. When she heard his footsteps, she turned to look at him, smiling very wisely, her head turned to one side. "May I speak to you?" he asked her, without being snarled at by the captain. "But of course," she said. "Micah and Heywood went out an hour ago to fish on the other side of the island." He sat down beside her on the green froth of the moth. "Inez," he began, and he had never called her by that name before. "I wonder if you will be patient and listen to me for a moment." She nodded, saying nothing. She was never very glib of words. "It's this," he said, encouraged. "Perhaps being so much wiser you can help me. It's a bad day with me. I've got the horrors. Today I believe all your crazy stories, and try as I will, I can't escape from them. Today I feel the island is shutting me in, and I want to run away from the island. What am I to do?" "You must begin," she told him, "by making yourself more stupid than you are. Oh, it is easy for Heywood, more easy even for Judd. For you it is difficult. Can you not think only of today? Must you let your mind race on ahead?" Her voice was murmurous and very soft. He said, after a pause, "It would be easier, I think, if I might talk to you more often. Time, the time of the island, has touched you scarcely at all. With you, one almost ceases to feel the horror. If it were not for Micah, I would talk to you. Yes, whenever you want. But you know how I am situated." "Oh, don't think I'm trying to make love to you," he told her impatiently. "It's not that. It's only that you bring me peace. You're so beautiful, so restful." Doña Inés looked away from him, towards the green twilight. "Perhaps that wasn't very polite of me. In fact, it was clumsily expressed. Let me try once more. Listen, Inez. Your sanity, loveliness, a bright angel in a mad world. I respect you as I would respect a saint, but I want to be with you. I want to talk to you. I'm lonely when you're not there. I need your protection." Doña Inés looked away from him towards the green twilight of the trees. His eyes devoured her dark, clear-cut profile. She said at length, speaking very slowly in her grave, beautiful voice, "Mi querido, I can't grant your requests. I am too afraid of Micah, and perhaps I'm afraid of something else. Listen, if I saw much of you, I might forget that I should be a dead woman. I might forget that my heart is cold and my mind empty. I might wake up again, and I don't want to wake up. I'm afraid of life, after so many years, and already you are making my sleep a little restless." She turned her face towards him, and he saw the red flower mouth was trembling. A bright drop, that might have been a tear, save that she never wept, hung like a jewel upon the shadow of her lashes. Yet her face was radiant, transfigured, more sparkling than the sunshine. Straightway Patterson forgot about respect and saints and Captain Thunder, and kissed her on the lips. For one enchanted moment, she was acquiescent, then pushed him away, hiding her face in her hands. And he, realizing the horror that lay ahead for both, felt more like weeping than rejoicing. "Go away," she whispered. "Go away before you make me hate you for what you are doing. A moment ago, you talked of peace. Do you realize that you are stealing mine?" He stammered, scarcely knowing what he said. "There are better dreams." "Not here," she told him. "Here there are no dreams but bad ones, and so it is safer not to dream at all. Please, please go away." "Inez," he said eagerly, "I will go away. We'll both go away. If I build a boat or a raft and provision her, will you trust yourself to me? We'll escape. We may drown, but I promise you." He stopped. In her tired yet vivid eyes, he had suddenly surprised, for the first time, the dead, haunted look that so much disconcerted him when he glimpsed it in the other's gaze. It was as if she retreated very far away, drawing down blind. She said patiently, as one speaking to a child, "Oh, my dear friend, please, don't be so foolish. I've tried. We have all tried so many times, and it hurts to fail so often." "Then you won't come?" She climbed slowly to her feet, brushing moss from her bright skirts. Then she shook her black silken head twice, very emphatically. "No, I will not come with you." "Then," said Patterson, "since I can't stay here to watch you with the captain, I shall escape alone. Won't you change your mind?" She came near to him and put her hand for one moment upon his shoulder. "No, I will not change my mind." And with a swishing of silk that sounded strange enough in that tropical emerald glade, she left him to his thoughts, and his thoughts were agony. For weeks he slaved in secret to build a great rakish-looking solid raft that grew slowly into shape as it lay, concealed amid the dusky green of overhanging branches. He had told no one save Doña Inés of his resolution to escape. The reason was simple. In his heart of hearts, he dreaded their bitter mockery, their cynical disbelief in any possible salvation from the trap of the island. Yet he still had faith. Once aboard his raft, and he would be forever borne away from those perilous and beckoning shores. He might find death, but this he did not really mind, although he much preferred the thought of human life with Inez. And then he had to remind himself that the Spanish woman was a thing of dust, to crumble away at the first contact with normal humanity, and that he would in any event be better without her, since she meant another mouth to feed. But he still desired her, and it was as though the captain knew, for she was very seldom left alone, and so he toiled in secret, and in his spare time nursed Judd, who lay sick of a poisonous snake bite that swelled his foot and turned it black, and would have meant death in any other land. Once, when his raft was nearly completed, he caught Inez alone on the beach, where against the background of golden rock she fed a swirling silver mass of seagulls. The birds wheeled, crying harshly, and Doña Inez smiled. She wore a knot of scarlet passion flowers in the dark satin of her hair. Patterson, determined not to miss a second alone with her, advanced triumphantly across the sands. The seagulls scattered. "Look, you frightened my birds," she complained indignantly. "Never mind the birds. They can see you whenever they want. I can't. Inez, haven't you changed your mind about coming with me?" She shook her head. "Inez, please, please listen. Even if we drown out there together, wouldn't it be better than this?" "Oh, yes, if we drowned. But we should not drown. We should come back here, to Micah, and then our lives would not be worth living." "My life," he said, "isn't worth living now. Not while I have to see you with that creature night and day." "Be quiet," she warned in a low voice. Patterson turned, following her eyes. Behind, only just out of earshot, stood the captain, watching them sardonically. The breeze lifted the skirts of his green taffeta coat, ballooning them about his slender body. The green, too, seemed reflected in his face. So pale was it, paler, more waxen, even than a corpse candle. "Are you also feeding the birds, Patterson?" inquired the captain softly. "No, I'm looking for turtles' eggs." "How many have you found?" the captain wanted to know. Patterson felt rather foolish. "None, yet." "Then you had better make haste, unless you wish to fast for dinner. Come, my Rose." And Captain Thunder turned away indifferently, followed by Doña Inés, who walked behind him obediently, her head bent, with no backward look. That night Patterson thought he heard weeping in the hut that lay only a few hundred yards from his own, and he crouched, perspiring, sleepless for many hours, until it was dark no longer, and bars of rose and lemon streaked the sky. Then he got up and went forth to the woods to complete his preparation for escape. He had rigged up a sail upon his raft, and had already floated her on a narrow lagoon that led towards the sea. He was taking with him 3 barrels of water, a barrel of bread, his fishing tackle, a blanket, and a flint and tinder. He knew he would not starve, since fish were plentiful, but he was aware that he would probably, unless he was fortunate enough to end in a shark's belly, die of a thirst that must endure for many days of torment and a pitiless and scorching heat. Yet he could not wait. He must start at once, before the sun was up, before the first sign of life from the hut nestling on the cliffs behind him. And so, at a moment's notice, he took his departure, nervous and weary and taut with anxiety, drifting with his raft like some dark bird against the misty violet blue of the lagoon at dawn. Everything was silent, trees and cliff and sky, the limpid reflection of these in the glassy waters of the lagoon. Even the monkeys and the chattering parakeets, all were frozen into a breathless silence that seemed to watch aghast the reckless departure of this creature, determined at all costs to break away from this sorrowful eternity. Soon it was daylight, and the sun beat gilded wings, and Patterson drew near to the sea. A curve in the lagoon showed him the tawny cliff, and above it the huts. From the captain's hut came a finger of blue smoke that climbed very straight into the bright clearness of the air. Goodbye, Inés. He was surprised to find how little pain there was for him in this parting. He reminded himself once more that she was a ghost, a creature of dust. He passed the rocks and was soon outside, away from the island on the sea itself. The ripples danced, white-crested as though laced with silver. Patterson fished with success. He tried to fry his breakfast and, failing, devoured it half raw, with a hunch of bread. It was very appetizing. After breakfast, he lay watching with ecstasy a stiff breeze swell his sail. Already the island seemed to have receded. Patterson gazed with exultation at the coral whiteness of its strand, the radiant green foliage of the trees. An hour before, and these had been loathsome to him. Now that they belonged to the past, he grimaced at them and waved his hand. The raft drifted on. The sea was kind to him that day. He thought so innocent and gay and tinted like forget-me-nots. Despite himself, despite his almost certain death, he found his mind flitting towards England and his life there, as though he were fated to be saved. He turned towards the island gleaming in the distance. Farewell! It was a cry of defiance. And then in a moment, like thunder splintering from the sky, came sudden and shattering catastrophe. He was never very clear as to what actually occurred. All he knew was that from peace and beauty there emerged swift chaos. A wall of water, all towering solid green and ribbed with foam, reared suddenly from the tranquil seas to bar his path, like some great ogre's castle risen by magic, huge, destructive carving of emerald. Then there was darkness and a tremendous roaring sound, and the raft seemed to buck like a frightened horse. He heard the ripping of a sail, and then he was pitched through the air, and something seemed to split his head, and he knew no more. When he awoke, the sun beat hot upon his temples. He felt sick. His limbs ached, and he groaned. He lay still, his eyes closed, and tried to remember what had happened, and then he heard a sound that might have been some dirge sighed by the breeze, a soft murmuring music that seemed to him familiar, the song of the island. He knew then that he was back upon the island. He had no need to open his eyes. "Oh God," he sighed, and a sweat trickled down his face, and then, inevitably, sounding close to his ear, the sneering, hateful voice of Captain Thunder. "Home so soon, my young friend? No, you would not believe, would you? You knew too much." Patterson made no sign of life. Back once more on the island for all eternity, the island. And then the murmuring song swelled louder, louder, mocking him, laughing a little, as Inés had laughed when he told her he was going to escape. The song of the island. and he must hear it forever. He opened his eyes to find the captain looking at him cynically. "Now that you understand there is no escape," said the captain, "perhaps you will not take it amiss if I venture to criticize your manner towards Madame Inez." But Patterson was not listening.